Rosh, and I'm glad to be back with the CSP program, or that's redundant, the Community Scholar program. And I am going to give you something a little different today. You've heard me before, or some of you have heard me before, talk about architecture and also about Holocaust commemoration and sites that were devastated and are being protected and preserved in Eastern Europe since the Holocaust. But today we're swerving. We're going to take a turn in another direction. Although my interest in this subject has grown out of both of those other areas, synagogue architecture and Holocaust commemoration. And in the coming lectures, I think that will become obvious. Because I'm giving 3 lectures, and I do hope you will come back after this one, that I won't frighten you away, I'll be circling back to things. So if there'll be some things that I'll intimate in this talk, but we'll come back and look at in a little more detail later. We also have the safety net in this first lecture. Those of you who have attended my other lectures know that I tend to try to pack a lot of material in, that if we don't quite cover everything, we have another shot at it next week and beyond. This talk, as Mark said, really deals mostly with the Jewish part of Jewish sculpture. We're looking how different types of carving and sculpting and modeling have been used by Jews for Jews in a Jewish context. It's not something that many people think about much of the time. I would say that sculpture is the neglected art, as much as Jewish art itself is often neglected in the world of art history. Sculpture is the neglected art within the study of Jewish art. And that is in large part because of the sense that Jews do not make sculpture, have not made sculpture, and in fact have not been allowed to make sculpture because of the prohibition stated in the Second Commandment. I'm having a problem moving my slot. Let's see. There we go. And most of you probably are familiar with that, about forbidden to make graven images or manner of likeness of anything that's in heaven above or earth beneath. What a graven image is, what an actual likeness is, has been debated for probably millennia. We don't have text going back that far. But certainly the idea that the Second Commandment is really not about making images, but is about idolatry, that has been debated more intensely in recent centuries. And particularly since the 19th century, there's been a feeling that a true understanding of the Second Commandment has to take it in its entirety, and it's really about making idols and worshiping idols more than making art. Think about the way we interpret the Second Amendment of the American Constitution, how that's been picked apart, but it really has to be, to my mind, be taken in its entirety to be understood fully. Even so, it has confused rabbis and others for centuries, that though there are prohibitions about making images, we have very specific instances in the Bible itself where Jews make images, and they make them and place them in the holiest places imaginable. So most of you are familiar with how God instructs Bezalel in the book of Exodus to create the Ark of the Covenant and the cherubim on the kaperot, on the mercy seat, the covering of the ark. And some of you will be familiar with the description in the book of Kings of the building of the Temple of Solomon, and how the so-called brazen sea is supposed to be supported on these 12 bronze bulls, all of which are sculpted and all of which derive in their forms from really ubiquitous representational forms, many of them actually associated with worship of other gods that were circulating in the Near East at that time. So these are protecting animals. They are quasi, well, I can't say, I don't know what they mean, but they were included. And so on the one hand, where Jews go forward through the centuries thinking they can't make sculpture, and yet they're also referring back to these instances. We know that Jews did carve, or they condone carving and decorative sculpture in their buildings. Beyond the Temple of Solomon and the Temple of Herod, we have many synagogues, over 100 synagogues that have been excavated, and many of them have carved decoration. Sometimes it's just architectural decoration, like an entablature or a capital, but sometimes there are symbols that are included, and occasionally there are even representational forms. So this is just a few. These are from the 4th, 5th century, probably in what is modern day Israel. And we also have instances from the diaspora. Now, who made these? Probably, obviously, architectural craftsmen and sculptors. We do not know whether Jews were active in these fields, but they were not prohibited. And we do have representations, and we have references in the literature to Jews in these crafts in antiquity. We also have representations in mosaic decorations of Jews building. It's often the Tower of Babel, but it's also some other structure. So we know that Jews, Jewish artists, Jewish patrons were intimately familiar with aspects of construction and design, and probably of decoration too. But we don't have signatures on these, but we do have clear Jewish symbols, as in these capitals, one from Caesarea and one from Capernaum, which show that if they weren't made by Jews, it was clearly these were specifically made for Jews. They were commissioned for Jews. So we're getting traditional Corinthian architectural capitals with these acanthus leaves here, but we have the menorah, which gives it a particularly unique stamp. You would not find the menorah on a Corinthian capital, on Augustan architecture in Rome, but in Eretz Israel, it was obviously not uncommon. So this is carving. People know how to do it, and they appreciate it, and they're not against it. And then we have more specific carving in holier places. We have a number of fragments from arcs from early synagogues. We have them in Eretz Israel in places like Nabratain, which I'm not showing, but this is from Ostiantica outside of Rome. And some of you may be familiar with the Great Ark, which has two large brackets that extend out over the capitals of the columns that frame the space, and on each of these brackets is carved a menorah. And the discovery of these back around 1960 is what alerted archaeologists that they indeed were excavating a synagogue at that time. So symbols are added as well as a decoration. And I could go on and show you many examples of architecture, but it gets a little boring, and it's not that important for our main theme. But I do want you to know that from the late 19th century, as synagogues began to be excavated and published, primarily in Palestine, through the Palestine Archaeological Agency, I forget the actual name, these became well known to not just scholars around the world, but also artists and architects who read these publications, and then sometimes architects who were fluent in German, because a lot of these publications were in German, like Arnold Brunner, who I actually talked about in my architecture lectures. He would then write about these things in English and include entries in the Jewish Encyclopedia, which was published around 1906. And all of this information trickled down, so it became common knowledge in the Jewish world. Another area of carving that we've become increasingly aware of is the ossuaries that were made in the 1st century BCE or CE, and a number of them have been found around Jerusalem, and you've probably seen or read many articles about these, and you'll see them in the Israel Museum and in other museums too. These are limestone boxes, and the nature of the limestone allows a very smooth cut and can be polished. And carved into these are all sorts of designs, geometric designs, decorative designs, and scholars argue over whether these have symbolic meaning or whether they are purely ornamental. And then inscribed in these are also inscriptions. So this is interesting because in the funerary context, we begin to get some kind of decoration. Better examples are at Beth Sharim in up by the in the Galilee and near the ancient city of Sepphoris, and here the largest collection of catacombs that comprise a vast necropolis, Jewish necropolis, from the period after the expulsion from Jerusalem. We find many different types of carved decoration. The stone in which the catacombs are cut is very soft, which is why it was easy to tunnel in them and make tombs, family tombs or group tombs. And often on the walls of these are decorations. The most common are menorahs, like these ones that you see here in, I think this is Catacomb 13. And this one is famous because there's a figure here of a man who holds one of these menorahs up over his head. And it's unclear whether this is meant to be an actual man or representing a candelabra, so that the candelabra itself, of which this is a representation, would have incorporated a figural element like an atlas figure in architecture holding up the menorah, sort of what you see here. People have given this figure many different names, but there's no real indication of who he is. The shell design is also very common, and we see these motifs through the catacombs. But Catacomb 20, which is known as the Catacomb of the Coffins, is remarkable because here there's row after row of these big stone coffins. So these were very important people who were being buried here. They had a lot of money that they could commission these sarcophagi, and many of these are decorated. And I'm just going to show you a few of the more striking ones. I was there a few years ago, and if you've never, it was my first visit, and it's absolutely an amazing place to see. But here we have, I think these are meant to be lions. They look a little bit like my dog, but who you might hear barking in the background. 2 lions over a bowl or a cup. Here we have 2 more ferocious lions on another sarcophagus. Here we have an interesting figure on this of a bull's head. And again, just like the bulls with the brazen sea at the Temple of Solomon, it's not clear what this bull is representing. Mark might have some ideas. Bulls are very common in many ancient religions as sacrificial animals. We see the bull dancers in Minoan art. We see the bull being slain in Mithraic art. But the bull doesn't really have much prominence in Jewish liturgy, except when we're talking about ritual slaughter. So why this head of the bull is there, I don't know. There are people who do know more, so I'm not going to dwell on this. And I didn't have time to ask my friend Stephen Fine or anyone else their thoughts on this. But it's interesting that we're seeing carving in a funerary context, and we see this when we go to Rome too. There are sarcophagi that have Jewish symbols, like the one on the top with a menorah, and the one on the bottom, which has essentially pagan symbols. These are theatrical masks, but in the plaque, which would have been left blank by the original carver, the Jewish client has put the inscription and included the menorah and the shofar and the lulav and the etrog, which are traditionally associated in these funerary contexts as representations of the temple and probably some kind of yearning for a messianic afterlife of some sort. This was very common in Rome. The most famous example of this type of carving is the so-called seasoned sarcophagus fragment, which used to be attributed to, said it was found in a Jewish catacomb, but there's no evidence of that. We don't know where it came from. It's been kicking around for a couple hundred years. But this is a typical Roman figurative sarcophagus with the seasons. This is just a fragment, and clearly a Jewish client purchased this ready-made from a monument store, a monument business, just like one would do by a headstone or a tombstone today, and then requested, instead of saying the normal portrait, a so-called Clypeus portrait that you would find on a Roman pagan sarcophagus, the client apparently requested a representation of the menorah here. And that's why we know it's Jewish. Otherwise, there's nothing Jewish about it at all. So this is an instance where we have non-Jewish carvers and non-Jewish workshops surely serving a multi-ethnic, multi-religious clientele, but tailoring it specifically for the Jewish client. But the Jewish client had no problem with a burial in a sarcophagus decorated by these pagan Hellenistic forms, figures on the sides. So, you know, in antiquity, it was a very large Jewish population, a very mixed and very diverse Jewish population, and there were Hellenized and Romanized Jews, and there were more traditional Jews who had more fealty to old temple traditions in the Holy Land. There was no one size fits all. So when we talk about ancient Judaism, we know it was a very mixed bag, and we just have to try to reconstruct it with a very small number of pieces that come down to us and try to make sense of it. But what we do find is that sculpture, just like painting, which we know there was a lot of, and mosaic decoration, of which we know there was a lot of, was part of the toolkit of artists, and it was part of what patrons might order, you know, for their needs. Jumping about 1,000 years, because we have very little evidence of any type, literary evidence, physical evidence from the early Middle Ages, late Antique and early Middle Ages. In the West, there's a little bit more from Byzantium, but nothing that is, we have images, but we don't have sculpture. So we go to Normandy, to Rouen, where one of the earliest medieval buildings, clearly identified as a Jewish site, has survived by accident. It was discovered a few decades ago underneath the present-day Palace of Justice. And only last year, only 3 years ago, was it finally, after many decades, open to the public, and you can visit it. They call it the Maison Sublime. And Norman Gold, Professor Norman Gold, from the late Norman Gold from the University of Chicago, has identified this as some kind of yeshiva or maybe a scriptorium. There might have been, you know, a prayer hall here too, but it is not what we would call primarily a synagogue. At least that's the now seems to be the majority opinion. There was a few decades of debate between Gold and his French colleague, which got quite heated and nasty over the years. But we have a little bit of carving, architectural carving, some figures here of a dragon, and there's some lions, and we don't know who carved these or why. We don't know who built the building, probably not Jewish masons. And maybe we can assume that the carving was not done by Jewish artisans either. Inside, we have lots of Hebrew graffiti, so we know that Jews were using it quite regularly. We have other bits and pieces of sculpture, of carving in Jewish context from the Middle Ages. I'm just going to show you 3 or 4 famous ones. This is the capital, one of the capitals in the synagogue in Worms, Germany, from about 1175. This building was totally destroyed in World War II and then rebuilt, but the capital survived. So it's a beautifully, crisply carved work. And the late Richard Krauthammer identified that the sculptors of this, the carvers here, were probably the same as those who worked on some Christian buildings, church in Fritzlar and some other places. So what we're probably talking about is itinerant carving workshops who were commissioned, in this case, commissioned by the Jewish community. And the carving is not in any way overtly Jewish, but the inscription along the very top is, and probably that would have been carved or traced out at least by a Jewish scribe, because it's very precise and specific. It's a biblical quote, which is slightly doctored. It refers to, it's a quote from the Book of Kings about the building of the temple, but it's slightly doctored so that the letters can be used to give a date as well. So again, we know that the Christians were probably carving, but the Jews were intimately involved in the carving work. In Prague, some of you, probably a lot of you have been here and seen this. On the Altneu Shul, at the entrance of the Altneu Shul, we have this beautiful relief in a pointed arch, the tympanum over the main door, with a tree with its roots going probably to the four rivers, and then vines with they're grapes. I'm willing to accept they're grapes. In an earlier lecture to this group, I think I called them pine cones, but you can see how much they look like pine cones, but the leaves are grape leaves, and these are grape vines. And so in one way, it's very Christian because we find the same imagery in Christian representation of the grapevine, because the grapes being the blood of Christ. But here it would refer to the holy wine used on Shabbat and the whole process of procuring that. And then there are more vegetal, very specific, and botanists have identified all of these leaves. These are all done from nature, carving on these little capitals underneath the vaults inside. So it's a very richly carved area. Again, we don't know who carved them. Were they Jews or not Jews? But we know that Jews ordered it, wanted it, and probably appreciated it, interpreted it, and I think that's what's important. Nobody smashed it. There were no iconoclasts who said we can't have sculpture, we can't have relief sculpture. But of course, here this is all from nature. It's not something from heaven above or the earth below. It is something of God's creation. In the synagogue in Sopron, now in Hungary, where I just was a few weeks ago and took these pictures, we have similar decoration, but here it's all, it's a mix of natural decoration on the side. We have vine scrolls with leaves on the sides of the ark, and then geometric patterns above. So it recalls those shapes from the ossuaries of the first century. Again, so we saw decoration in synagogues, and we see it also in funerary contexts. Beginning at least by the 16th century, we begin to see a lot of interesting carving on gravestones. We have gravestones in Europe, carved stones still extant from at least the late 12th century, and they really pick up in the 13th and 14th century. And then if you go to the cemetery in Worms, Germany, which is the best preserved, you'll see lots of these. Generally, the carving is exquisite, but the designs are very spare, and the decoration is essentially the text and nothing but the text. But the skill done in carving the letters, either as raised letters or as recessed letters, is very, very apparent. And because this is carving Hebrew, I think we have to assume these were Jewish carvers doing this work. We can't imagine a Christian stonecutter carrying out those designs. But by the 15th, 16th century, we begin getting more images. and more decoration, a kind of migration of some of the elements from the Renaissance and Baroque architectural style finds its way into onto the gravestones. This is a very clear example of that. This is from Germany in the 18th century, photographed by my friend Falk Weismann. And this is really just a Baroque tombstone, and you can see the elaborate carving of the flowers and the vines, but also the innovative shape as well. My favorite gravestones, and I think the favorite of many, come from actually the part of the world where my own family emigrated in Bukovina, in what is now northeastern Romania. And these are from, there are 3 cemeteries in the town of Siret. There's the old cemetery, the middle cemetery, and the new cemetery. The old cemetery, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, has very striking gravestones, but rather severe in their design. The middle cemetery, and I believe these ones are from the middle cemetery, but the ones I'm going to show you in a minute certainly are much more they're tactile. They have and they're much more complicated in their designs. You can see the animals, the lions, which we'll see again coming many times. But you'll see the increasingly complex sort of Baroque designs. We have a hand, and it looks like a snake is licking the hand there. We have deer or stags flanking the inscription for the deceased, and then we have griffins up top, who are really stand-ins for the cherubim from the Ark, and they're flanking the Torah. There's books down here, so we're dealing with probably a rabbi, a scholar. I haven't looked at these in detail, but these have been transcribed and studied in recent years. These photos are from my friend Murray Zimilis, who I'm going to mention a little bit later, who was the curator of a terrific exhibition called Jeweled Lions and well, I have it right here. The title is, I always forget the exact title, Gilded Lions and Jeweled Horses, all about Jewish folk art, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But he finds the antecedents of that in these types of designs, and these stone carvers probably would have been doing, they might have been doing tracings for paper cuts, they might have been doing stencils for wall decoration in synagogues or private houses. It's quite likely they were multi-talented and worked in different media. But these are some of the most creative and unique gravestones that we have from anywhere, and most of these are probably from the 18th century, but the style continues well into the 19th century as well. These stones are actually from the cemetery where my great-grandparents are buried. And this is also in Bukovina, and it's in Radutz. And here you see the same kind of lines. These are later, these are 19th century. So the design, it's a much flatter type of decoration. And you can really see that how easy it is to, these are soft stones, so how easy it is to carve out the voids, but how similar it is to what we're familiar with from paper cuts. If any of you are in New York and have seen the show about ancient sculpture and it's polychromy, that is the painting of ancient sculpture. There was a similar show out at the Getty about 5 years ago in Los Angeles. You can see that Jewish gravestones too were once painted, and but the paint has faded. But in this case, in Radutz, we're lucky to have a good selection that still maintain some of their beautiful color. So the same type of carving is apparent in the decoration of synagogues, and we see it in the synagogue arcs, almost all of which are destroyed, but we have photographs that were taken in the interwar period. And Branka Yaniv has done a terrific book about 5 or 6 years ago on these carved arcs, but you can see the same kind of vitality and ingenuity in design here that you see in some of those Siret gravestones. We have animals of all sorts entwined, and this one at Zelwa, and then the other ones, well, these are Olkaniki, Sidra, all of which are destroyed. They all have animals, bears and sheep and deer and leopards and sometimes fish, and it's quite remarkable. And Druya, which is one of the best documented, that is, the photographs that we have are the most detailed, has a whole series of carvings from the double-headed eagle of the empire to the griffins, who are like the lions, like the cherubs protecting the Torah, the crown of the Torah. We have the blessing hands of the Kohanim, and then we have animals all throughout. And you can see them embedded in the carving here. Of course, we can only go with the photos. This must have been a spectacular thing to see in its physicality, but alas, that's lost. But Branchiani has made the case, I think quite convincingly, that this type of carving probably reflects certain liturgical poems and other tales, but she particularly points to the Parakshira, which is a prayer, or it's kind of like a story prayer, in which all of the animals of creation are given voice to praise God. And so the snake, the fish, the sea monster, the cat, the dove, the tame goose, the wild goose, the eagle, the stork, and many more. I'm only showing you one page of this text, which is really quite long. And in that case, the spoken word of the synagogue is connected with the sensual experience of what you see. So hearing and sight are linked as part of the worship experience. We have more modest examples of this type of carving, which have come down to us, often accidentally as survivors, not often in context because of the destruction of the Holocaust. This is a Torah ark from the 18th century, so about the same time as that German Baroque gravestone I showed you. This is from Bavaria, from southern Germany, and it's brightly colored. So you see that the arcs were painted just like the stones, and the carving, these wonderful lions, they look rather devilish up there, supporting the Keter Torah at the top of the structure. These are two lions who have lost their perch, and they are from also from Germany. And they're from Bohemia, now part of Czechia, the Czech Republic. This tradition we're familiar with because we see many examples. We know many examples from America. This is one that was in the show that Murray did. They're now in Kansas City. It's unknown where they were made. It's quite likely a lot of these were made in New York and in Boston, where we know there were carvers. New York was the biggest center of immigrant carvers who came to America. They had the experience of building arks, making arks, but they also branched out into new directions, as we will see. These are scattered remnants without provenance. We know that there were hundreds of little stibbles and little shuls in major cities, which were often painted and often had carved arcs, and these began to close even in the 1920s and 30s, and many of them were left vacant and sold and destroyed in the 60s and 70s. But collectors, a few collectors and some museums were eager. They had the foresight to gather up these pieces. Unfortunately, they rarely did good documentation, and they just took the choice pieces, so we don't have the full understanding of how these looked in context. This is a display. I think it's no longer on view, but this used to be in the basement of the Eldridge Street Synagogue in New York, down in the Beit Midrash, which was still in use. They had all of these rescued fragments from arcs from other Lower East Side synagogues. But a few are still there. You can see a few. This is from New Haven, Connecticut, in the Beth Israel Synagogue from 1925, also known as the Orchard Street Synagogue. It's the last of the group of big Orthodox synagogues in that city. The rest were torn down in the 1970s for urban renewal. And you can see the carved hands and the lions and the crown and the eagle. The eagles are very prominent on American arcs. We don't have the two-headed eagle of the Russian Empire or the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, but we have the American eagle who shows up again and again. And mostly in the arcs made by a man named Sam Katz, an immigrant who came to the Boston area and made about a dozen arcs that we know about. This is one of the biggest and finest in the Walnut Street Shul, and I know the Walnut Street Shul is one of our, is in the audience today. So I want to give a shout out to them. And this is, there's beautifully carved lions here up on the, by flanking the tablets. Now the Walnut Street Shul has also made it a point of pride to collect pieces of from the closed shuls of Chelsea and other parts of Massachusetts. So they have several other arcs down below in the lower level where the Beit Midrash and a Sabbath chapel are, and those also have carved arcs. So a visit there is well worth it, and you can see, besides the beautiful painted ceiling, you'll see some great carving. So this is the Sam Katz arc from the Walnut Street Shul. Probably done after the synagogue opened, but we're not sure. So maybe the late teens or around 1920, and that would fit in with his career. But most of the carvers couldn't make a living carving, making synagogue arcs. So the carvers, the woodworkers, found someplace else to go, and that was they made carousel horses and other types of wooden Indians, things like that. But the carousel horses were a specialty of Jewish wood carvers, and the Illian's workshop in Brooklyn was the center for a lot of this production, but there were several other workshops as well. And if you look very carefully, and this is a photo from Murray's exhibition, it's hard to see in this photo, but up over the doorway is a set of lions flanking a decalogue. So either someone here carved it and brought it with them, or maybe they were making it for somebody, or maybe they just had it here as inspiration. But probably some of these carvers made synagogue arcs on the side when needed. Illian's, who was born in Vilna, then Poland, now Lithuania, it should be 1871, not 1971, sorry, was already a well-known carver in the 1890s, by about 1890, and then he was making carousel horses by the late 90s and then opened his own workshop. And a lot of important carvers got their start working with him, and just two worth noting: Solomon Stein and Harry Goldstein, who worked together as carver and painter. This is one of their horses on the left, and then Charles Carmel. This is one of his on the right. These were both in the exhibition at the American Folk Art Museum that Murray Zimmelis curated, and these photos come from the catalog of that exhibition. All right, so switching gears, there are a lot of other things in the synagogue that are sculpted: relief works, decorative work, and I'm going to go through them very quickly, and you'll just see that they may surprise you, because people say, oh, there are no figures, you can't have figural decoration in the synagogue. And yet in the 18th century in Central Europe, there were many synagogues that had Torahs that were decorated with Torah shields that had figures of Moses and Aaron right there on the Torah, right there in the ark. So you can't get any holier, can't get to a more sacred space in the synagogue, and there were figures. Nobody thought that this was idolatry. Nobody was worshiping Moses and Aaron. To my knowledge, there are no complaints. There may be some responsa literature that hasn't been transcribed or translated, but this was something that was accepted. But Jews were not making this metalwork. These were all done by Christian metalsmiths, though Jews in different times in Europe did do some metalwork, particularly gold work with gold thread and other things. It's interesting, in the Muslim world, Jews did all the metalwork because that was a dirty profession, so Jews and Christians did it. But in the world of Christian Europe, metalsmithing was restricted to guilds, and Jews were mostly kept out of the guilds. And so the high quality work in gold and silver and this artisanal type of design, that was left to Christians. But Jewish patrons snapped it up, and we have a lot of information on some of these. These were often dedicated, so there's a little inscription down here which gives the dedication about who donated it, and we know where it was made. This is from Wrocław, which in Germany, which was German Breslau in eastern Poland. And George Keller the younger, both he and his father, George Keller the older, were noted metalsmiths of that town at that time. Michael Gross probably made this one in Hermannstadt, Hungary, and again, it's very elaborate. This not only has Moses and Aaron, but it has Abraham and Isaac in a scene up above. It's the Akedah, and you can see a detail of that here. So we really do get a lot of figurative decoration creeping into the synagogue when we don't expect it. This is a modern example by Ilya Shur. Sorry. This is a modern example of a Torah sheaf by Ilya Shur, one of the great post-war interpreters of Jewish tradition in a modern language, and he too would include, in a very abstract way, figurative decoration in panels, and you'll see them in many of his works. Shur. We'll see some Torah Crowns in just a second by Ilya Shur as well. So the same rule followed on Torah Crowns. Here you see a very decorative one from probably Eastern Germany or Poland. Figures, we have the Akedah again, bells, we have birds, we have lions. It's quite a collection. We have a winged little angel or messenger of God, not just the hand of God, coming down to inform Abraham. And this is clearly the way Christians depict the scene. And so we can, if we didn't know for other reasons, we would pretty much know that this was a Christian artist. They get more and more elaborate. These are from Vienna and from Lviv or Lemberg. And you can see the lions, again, the Akedah, and so on. The Akedah, of course, was important because it's the covenant between God and the people of Israel, or Abraham and his descendants, and the covenant essentially then becomes expressed in the Torah, and this is the crown of the Torah. But sometimes you won't see the Akedah, you'll see the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, which are the kind of distillation of Torah teaching. And here, if you look closely at the top of this one from the 18th century from Lemberg, you'll see that same kind of metalwork with the figures, a stork and a lion, all sorts of animals. And this is the kind of decoration that Ilya Shur will do in more contemporary times. Winged lions or birds, it's quite fantastical. And anyone going to a synagogue in Eastern Europe, particularly a big synagogue, maybe not the little, corner tailor's shul or carpenter's shul that you went to for your daily minyan, but the place you went to for Shabbat or for the holidays, you would know these, you would see these. They were quite important. And so a young man thinking about art, this is where they would see it, because they're not going into Christian churches. There are no art museums. They're not being invited to the Noble Palace. So this is as close as they're getting. But it's enough. It's enough to inspire a generation of artists in the late 19th and early 20th century. So these are the Ilya Shur images. They're very hard to see because they're complex. Here you can work out the figure, hands raised. And here's, this one is, it looks like an angel coming down and presenting something to Abraham, probably. So in a kind of modern idiom, Ilya Shur, who came to the U.S. as a boy, I think he was. I'm sorry, as a man, he was trained in art academies and technical work in Europe. He crosses this bridge. He was inspired by modernism in Europe in the interwar periods, but he had one foot firmly in Jewish tradition. His contemporary Ludwig Volpert, on the other hand, really developed an entirely new idiom for similar liturgical items. These are two Torah crowns designed by Volpert in the 1950s, and he totally dismisses the older language and figurative language and relies entirely on sort of elegant form. He came out of the tradition of the Bauhaus, but he uses the Hebrew letters as the primary design element in a lot of his work. So he uses it like the tools, building tools, and he creates structures, designs, but they all say something. So this one on the right says, "Thine, O Lord, is the kingdom, and thou art exalted as head above all," from Chronicles. And his inscriptions, what he chooses is very personal in a lot of these images, in a lot of these works. This is in memory of his father. So most of the quotes, many of the quotes that you'll find in Volpert works, do not turn up in other places. Okay, we'll just check the time here. Okay, so other metalwork, yods. You're all familiar with yods that are used for those of us who have poor eyesight. You have to follow the text in the Torah. The hand, but of course it recalls that hand of God that comes down, stopping the sacrifice of Isaac. Anytime there's an intervention, you can go back to look at the murals at the synagogue in Dura Europos from the 3rd century. The hand of God is always intervening, always bringing a miraculous solution. So these are pointers, but they're also wonderful little handheld pieces of sculpture. And then the ends have devices, lions usually, but sometimes some other forms. And these were ubiquitous. These were everywhere. Every synagogue would have them. Valuable ones would be of silver and ivory, but they could be made of almost any material, even wood. And quite a number have survived. This is a hanging lamp, a type of what's called sometimes the Judenstern, the star-like lamp, hung for Sabbath and festivals with oil wicks in all of these little spouts. This one from Germany, probably from around 1700, really looks like a piece of German decorative metalwork, but they are figures from the Bible who parade along the edge up here on the top, and then it's topped by a lion with flags. This is using themes that are familiar from other non-Jewish types of decorative work, but clearly adapting them for the Jewish context. And here's another example from Frankfurt from the 18th century. And then similar to this, we have the Hanukkah lamps. In Italy, they become very popular, these brass lamps, and with the figure of Judith. And Judith, along with Judah Maccabee, become the big figural symbols of heroism that are celebrated on Hanukkah. And there are many different versions of this from Italy. Every Jewish museum in Italy has at least one of them. This is a more recent example, though, from modern times, from the 20th century. And we'll come back and look at this a little later when we're talking about the Bezalel school and the revival of sculpture in Eretz Israel in the 20th century. Other types of menorah, of Hanukkahs with figures from different parts of the world. This is from Venice. This is from Prague. So they all have figures. And then this one, a more modern one with Moses, is by the 20th century sculptor Beno Elkin, who we'll talk about again later. And this fits in again with the Zionist revival of sculpture in the early 20th century, which we'll talk about next week. And then there are contemporary takes on this, which you can see here, all sorts of sculpture, ready-mades, if you will. But the menorah has become really a place where people can play around. And Richard Meyer's architectural one of postmodernist skyscrapers. Spice boxes, also great variety. Again, the Akedah, different types of amulets. Again, the Akedah, very popular. And the plates that are used for the Pidya Ben, these are very popular in the late 18th and 19th century in Poland and Ukraine. And they were turned out in large numbers. And we have a good supply that have survived. And some of them have the zodiac symbol. These are just usually, the fancy ones are silver, but they can be any metal. And then they're embossed with the design hammered out from the back. So we see a lot of these. And again, the Akedah is predominant. But we also get it showing up in stone reliefs. This is an odd piece, and I don't know the purpose of it, whether it was originally part of a gravestone or whether it was some other memorial, but it's in the Jewish Museum in Amsterdam. All right. I'm going to hold off on some other things, and I'm going to end with these last unusual works, a tzedakah box and a plate for Rosh Hashanah, where you see, again, both embossed and engraved decoration on this plate from Jerusalem. And then I love this hand, since we're seeing the raised hands again and again, and the hand coming out from heaven. This is a hand going up, an extending hand, asking for alms. Give us money. It's a tzedakah box from the Czech Republic, from Bohemia, from the 19th century. Oh, it looks like I have one more. And then wedding rings. These are medieval, and they're sculptural. And it's debatable. People think these may have been made by Jews for Jews, because Jews did some gold work. But this is a very contemporary set of wedding rings by a modern Israeli artist. They're engagement rings, and together they give you the letters of Shin and Mem, meaning Shem or name, and it's to unite the couple with these two rings. Okay, so I'm going to stop here, and next week we will move on to modern synagogue architecture. Modern synagogue art, and we'll see both a mix of the use of the figure, the introduction of the figure in the work of artists such as Louise Caiche, and the use of abstraction in the work of artists like Mitzi Solomon Cunliffe and Ibram Lassow and Seymour Lipton and others. So let me end that now. Okay.
Thank you very much, Samuel. I should say Sam. You said call me Sam, so I'm calling you Sam. That was most enlightening. We have some questions in the chat. I think you can access the chat. So why don't you field your own questions? We can take about 5 or 10 minutes now. So, I think there are 3 or 4 questions. Have a look. Can you see them?
All right, I have to go back up to the top. Okay.
Or if you want, I can just articulate the ones that seem interesting. How about that?
Yeah, I think this person is talking about maybe Prague, but I don't think they're fig leaves. I think they are not
Okay,
fig
well,
leaves.
the problem is this: if you address the questions, you have to actually say what the questions are.
Okay, okay.
Let me
Why don't you find some interesting
Sure.
questions?
Sure, just a couple of enlightening things. Just as people mentioned, actually, did somebody please mute yourselves? I'm hearing, okay. So a couple of enlightening things. By the way, Leonie points out that this session is dedicated to the memory of Polly Sloan, whose husband was also a doctor and a sculptor, so that's appropriate. Bernice mentions that the Bavarian Torah Ark with the lions is currently on display in Houston in its Judaica exhibition. So Rochelle Ampersand wants to know, did the carvers of carousel horses leave any marks on them of a Jewish nature? So such as that they transferred their spirit from shul to horse. That's an interesting. I don't think she means physical marks. I think she wants to know if there's anything Jewish about the carousel horses.
All right, you might get a little feedback from me, and I should have plugged in my headphones before. I'm afraid if I do it now, I might lose audio. But the answer, as far as I know, is no. There is, other than the workmen themselves, these are works in two different spheres. The horses and the synagogue decoration. But there were many carousels in Jewish neighborhoods that kids rode, though. So maybe that would be one connection. Okay,
super. Another question is, you showed a Torah crown with an Akedah, and you mentioned that the motif was Christian. Linda Sandhouse wants to know what was specifically Christian about that representation of the Akedah, the binding of eyes.
Yeah, there are a couple things. I particularly mentioned the messenger of God, who in Jewish depictions, it's usually just a hand of God coming down from heaven. This is a full winged angel that looks like it comes out of a Bernini chapel, a Baroque chapel. So it's a Christian interpretation. Also, Christian depictions not always, they tend to show Abraham with a long sword, whereas Jewish depictions usually have him with a knife. There are some other distinctions as well. It's not hard and fast because at a certain point, Jewish artists began to copy Christian artists, so we get some of the Christian interpretation creeping in.
Okay, excellent. Chanel Klein asks or advises talks on Sephardic art antiques, not antiques, but teaks, that is Torah, teaks, Torah boxes. That's something to consider. Gail Meltzer asks, were there any Jewish sculptures in the 17 through 1900s working on objects that were not religious, but secular art? So pre-modern age, if we think of modern age as being starting in the 1900s, let's say somewhere in the middle, secular objects that survived made by Jewish sculptors.
Yeah, so the first part about teaks, teaks are structural. They're the wooden or metal boxes that are used in Romaniot, Greek communities, and in many North African communities, and in Iraq and Iran, and the Torah is upright. And these were often decorated. They're usually of wood with leather coverings, or sometimes they are covered with silver or some other metal, and that's often studded with decoration or embossed, usually patterned. I don't know teaks. I imagine some may have inscriptions at certain points. So they were, in a sense, sculptural. And interesting, I didn't show it, but Ludwig Volpart has made, there's one in the Jewish, it's a drawing in the Jewish Museum of a beautiful teak type of that he made, but the entire body, the metal body, is an inscription. So it's kind of like a stencil, and you can see through it. So the scroll is inside, but you can actually the metal frame is a text. The other question is about other types of secular decoration. Yeah, Jews live just like everybody else. So if an archaeologist is digging a Jewish house and finds a lot of stuff, unless they find something that is specifically Jewish, like a Hanukkah lamp or a mezuzah or a text in Hebrew, they might not know that Jews live there, because Jews, 90% of what Jews consumed was what everybody else in the society consumed. So they loved decorative boxes, they loved fancy clothes, they loved jewelry, they loved leather goods. Most of these things don't survive because if they survive, because they're not specifically marked as Jewish, they're not surviving in Jewish museums. And because of the disruptions of history, they generally don't pass down through the generations in families, like happened in many noble Christian families where people can trace their goods back hundreds of years. And then similarly, obviously the disruption of Jewish life through expulsions from many different countries at different times, and also deprived Jews of all of these goods. So they've been dispersed. But surely if you went into the house of a Jewish merchant, whether in York, England, or in Frankfurt, Germany, or in Ferrara, Italy, at different times, you would walk into a very well-appointed house with beautiful, beautiful objects. We know this.
Yes. Well, I really very much appreciate your participation today, Sam. And I know our audience looks forward to hearing from you on the 23rd, which is next Tuesday, and the 30th, which follows. Just want to make sure that those are all Tuesdays. Am I correct about that? Yes. So the next 2 Tuesdays. And for those of you who are disappointed in seeing me, your erstwhile host, Ari Katz, will return, and we look forward to see all of you at that time. Thank you so much, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you, Sam. It was wonderful.
I think they're just disappointed that you're not presenting, Mark.
Oh, I don't know. I presented far more than my share.
I love them. I love them. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All
Take
right.
care.
See you.